It's been a joy to us to be able to get Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas to Australia. Both Jorgen and myself had heard her speak before, and when we started talking about a conference, she was to the forefront of our minds, and that she was able to accept the invitation. It gave her the opportunity to come over here and do some work with other people as well, with AusHelp, with John Mendoza, and she's off to Western Australia as well. So to be able to get a person of this quality to speak to this conference says a lot about the work that you people are doing. Sally has her own story, which I'm certain that she will share. But she's the CEO of the Carson Spencer Foundation in Colorado, in Denver, Colorado, which is under about 2 foot of snow at the moment, so she's actually quite happy to be here with us. She's an internationally recognised authority on workplace suicide prevention and crisis response after suicide, what they call postvention. And for those people who are cricket tragics, and I saw Tim Corney somewhere, who's the greatest cricket tragic I know, you would have seen that when we went to ad breaks, they had an ad called Man Therapy. Did anyone pick that up? Well, Sally's foundation is the creator of Man Therapy that's being run by Beyond Blue in Australia. So Sally comes with a wealth of experience and her own personal journey. And can you join me, please, in welcoming Sally to the stage?
The Phoenix Hope can wing her way through the desert skies and still, defying fortune's spite, revive from ashes and rise. That's what I'm going to speak about today. How do we rise from a devastating loss as unimaginable as the loss from suicide? I want to thank John and Jorgen and the whole Mates in Construction team for inviting me out here. I have to laugh every time I get that introduction because honestly, I'm here to learn from all of you. I've been working in the space of suicide prevention in the workplace for quite some time now, and I have never, ever seen an effort like what's going on in this room. All across the world, you have something incredibly special going on here, and I'm tweeting like mad over there to my followers across the world because this is a story that needs to be shared. And I'm just honored to be a part of the journey with you. I've invited Jorgen and others who are involved in this effort here to come to the United States for both a Colorado Construction Industry Council in April and a World Forum on Workplace Mental Health in September. And your story will be shared. So thank you for being leaders in this space. Now, throughout the course of the day, those of you who are new to the world of suicide prevention are going to hear a lot of data. Hearing that piece of data this morning, that construction workers are 6 times more likely to die by suicide than a workplace safety accident was stunning to me. Again, I'm learning from you. I put that out there in Twitter land, and it got retweeted like 8 times right away. You're going to hear a lot of data today, and data that's going to inform you about this very big, critical public health issue. But what I always like to remember is that behind every statistic, there is a family that's been impacted and there's a life that's been lost. And this quote here by Dr. Irving Selikoff, he's a physician and a cancer researcher, and he was actually talking about cancer, but it applies to our conversations today. Statistics are merely aggregate numbers with the tears wiped away. So knowing that there are many of you in this room that have been touched in some way, maybe it was a coworker, maybe it was a family member, maybe it's your own struggle. I want to honor you. I want to honor you for coming in here and learning more about this and being a force for change. Together we're going to save lives. And by transferring that meaning-making process from loss or struggle to a positive, proactive effort in your community is huge. I also want to let you know whether you're a survivor of suicide loss or suicide attempts or have had this issue in your family, you're not alone. I lost my brother to suicide on December 7th, 2004. Now, many people have a flashbulb memory in their life, something that really was very critical. Usually it's traumatic, in the United States for sure, but probably internationally. We all kind of remember where we were on the day of 9/11. You know, I can remember there was a call I got. My husband said, you need to go next door because we didn't have a television. I had an infant son. Go next door and watch the television. You're not going to believe what's happening. And I can remember running over there with my baby, sitting on some shag carpet. I can remember every image that we saw, hours and hours of that. I have another flashbulb memory, and that's the day my brother died. I had been on maternity leave. I had just had my third child, and it was the night that I actually got to go visit my students. At the time, I had been a professor at Regis University, and I was teaching leadership development. And I'd been away from school for about 3 months raising my baby. And as it was my third child, having children is a wonderful thing, but I missed my structure of my work, and I missed my students very much. And so put all the kids in the car, and off we went. Now, I live in the foothills of the Rocky Mountain area, and this party was about an hour and a half away at a student's home. And so we were driving along the route there, and it was a very hopeful evening. I've got my 3 kids in the back seat. My oldest, Nicholas, who was 6 at the time, is teaching his younger brother, Tanner, the dreidel song, and the baby sitting in his little car seat. I remember the car smelling like ham. I've got that in the back seat filled with cloves and a little present for the host family and a poinsettia, and I'm wearing some god-awful 80s Christmas sweater, because that's who I am, and little gingerbread man earrings and so forth. And my phone rings. And it's my mother. Now, usually I won't be answering the phone with my children in the car on a December evening on the icy roads of Colorado, but my brother had been very ill in that week leading up to that moment. So I took the call in hopes that we had gotten some news, positive news. And she says to me, "Pull over." And I said, "Okay, Mom." I just happened to be at the exit that I would take to get to her house. It wasn't the exit I needed to take to the party, but I was just a few meters away from that exit. And so I said, "Oh, give me just a second. I will pull over on Federal Boulevard." And then there was silence, which is very unusual. So I get to the exit and I say, "Okay, Mom, what is it? You're killing me." She said, "Put the car in park." She said, "Our worst fears have been confirmed. Your brother has committed suicide." And whenever you get news like that, your whole world just kind of spins on its head. So I'm in the car, and I'm screaming, and I'm crying, and somewhere in the chaos of all that moment, I drop my phone on the floor. And so I get out of the car, and I'm on my hands and knees on the side of the road on a dark December night, fumbling around, trying to look for this phone. And in the back seat, there's the little voice. It's my Nicholas. Slices through the chaos like a laser beam, and he says, "Mommy, I'm crying for you." Now, my brother only knows his Uncle Carson as this magical person, as this man's man, this larger-than-life character who's funny and engaging and throws him up in the air like Superman and teaches him the finer points of shooting pool and how to ski down double black diamonds and all of this crazy stuff. My son does not understand what's just happened. And at some point, right in the middle of that, I realize that I have to somehow pick myself up from the shattered pieces of glass that I feel like on the side of the road, pull myself together in some shape or form for that mom on the other side of the phone and those 3 kids in the back seat. I get in the car, and it's everything I can do from that point on, getting up to my parents' house and reminding myself, red light means stop, green light means go. 6 months before this happened, my brother had his first full-blown episode with bipolar disorder. My brother had, by all accounts, been a very, very successful man. He was 34 when he died. He happened to have gotten a diagnosis of bipolar disorder when he was a college student. He had made some pretty reckless decisions when he was a student there and got sent home by the university for a year. My father freaked out by this chain of events and took him to see a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist gave him a diagnosis of bipolar 2, and for those of you who are familiar with how this works, that's the less intense form of bipolar, which meant he had moderate highs, where he was very charismatic and driven and visionary and funny. We called him the Pied Piper. He was an exceptional salesman, an entrepreneur, and a business leader, and he used that kind of energy, that energy to attract people to his work. And he was very, very genuine in his relationships with others. And then we had periods of depression, where he'd be filled with self-loathing, self-hatred. He would hole up in his basement, and sometimes he would self-medicate with alcohol or marijuana or whatever he needed to do to feel better. Sometimes he would venture out and get some help, professional help. But the rest of the world never knew this. The rest of the world never knew his suffering. They only saw this magical person. The summer of 2004 was different. For the first time in his life, he had a full-blown episode of mania and went way above that level that he usually hung out at into very destructive behaviors. He left his wife, his 2.5-year-old daughter, and his business colleague. He moved into $1 million loft, bought an $80,000 car, laptops for employees he didn't have, and just unraveled his life so fast. By 3 months later, he had spent every penny that he had. We can actually trace it to the moment that the accountant said, "You are broke, and you can get no more money, you are completely done." And he flipped into a depression that was so dark he was unrecognizable. We had just 2 weeks. The family rallied around him. I'm a psychologist by training. I had been in the field of mental health 16 years before this happened. We all came together, tried to rally to get him resources and help. And I asked him, I said, "Carson, given what you've been through, it's understandable that you might be suicidal." And he said, "Well, I've thought about it, but I'd never do it because of my daughter." Now, for me, at that point, without the training that I have now in suicide risk assessment and management, that answer was good enough. But now what I know is that when somebody is as agitated as my brother was, as despondent as my brother was, it's a question that needs to be asked again and again and again. We had 2.5 weeks when he came back. We read this book, The Unquiet Mind, which is a memoir by Kay Redfield Jamison. She herself lives with bipolar 1, the more extreme form. She herself has had lethal, near-lethal suicide attempts. And she's a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University. So I sat down with Carson and I said, "Look, here's this woman. She is powerful. She is intelligent. She is a very public and hugely successful person, just like you. She's gotten through this. She shares her story of hope and recovery. We can do this. There's hope, there's hope, there's hope." And he turned to me and he said, "You know what, Sally? It's madness." And less than a week later, he took his life. Now, I don't know exactly what he was trying to say to me in that moment, but I have a pretty good idea. My brother was an exceptionally determined man. He got through all kinds of challenges in his life, and he was fearless. I believe what he was trying to tell me is that he had lost hope, that he could regain the kind of life that he had before as a business leader and a respected person in his community because of the stigma around what he had been through. And that just makes me so mad. It makes me incredibly mad that somebody who has a treatable type of condition, something that friends can really help with, come together and support someone through their dark time, that they have to go through all these other social challenges to get what they need to get better. On the night that he died, my brother's good friend from Atlanta called my brother's wife and said, "Oh my God, what can I do?" And she said, "No matter what you do, don't let him be forgotten." So on the night that he died, the seeds for the ideas of the Carson J. Spencer Foundation were born. And it's beyond the scope of today to talk about the different things that we do. But one of the things that was really important to us is that we both honor the life that was lived as his entrepreneurship and business leadership filter through everything that we do, and find bold, innovative solutions to prevent what happened to him from happening to other people. So suicide prevention in the workplace became our first entree into that effort. And we are really looking now, industry by industry, on how we can best make those changes, and construction industry is at the top of our list. The aftermath of my brother's death was very much like a tsunami. In fact, he died December 7th, 2004, 2 weeks before his 35th birthday, 2 weeks before Christmas, and 2 weeks before the Asian tsunami hit. And I remember looking back months later and really deciphering the many parallels that existed between the international response to that disaster and our family's response. The first few weeks were absolutely like a sense of drowning, fighting for every breath, not knowing day from night, hunger, all of those kinds of things were just turned on its head. And I remember having a very, very strong sense of fear. We live in Denver, Colorado, and the airport is miles and miles away. And we decided to hold his memorialization service anyway, and in the middle of the holidays, and so people were flying out from all over the country to pay their respects. And so I was driving out to the airport on a regular basis, and I would have these dissociative experiences where I literally wasn't present as I'm driving. I'm somewhere else. And I would come to these experiences with a flood of panic because it was fairly unsafe that you were not attending when you're driving. But then that panic would go on, and I'd fear for my kids' safety. I'd fear for all kinds of things, that the world was going to end and so forth. And that was just over and over and over again in those first couple weeks. At some point, though, I had to come back to my life, which was a very difficult transition. I had been out, as I told you, for months with my maternity leave. But this date loomed in front of me, January 3rd, and at some point I had to come up and deal with work and obligations and things like that. And I remember when I came back to work not knowing how I was going to respond or what to expect, and I opened my office door, and my desk was piled with well wishes, cards, stuffed animals, flowers. People said, "We're here for you." Now, not everybody gets that in this circumstance, but I felt very fortunate to know that my workplace was going to be there for me. But when I emerged from that sense of drowning, like the tsunami situation, and I looked around the landscape of my life, everything was different. Everything had changed. Things I thought were so important weren't. I had conferences, I had classes I was going to teach, and I just couldn't get motivated. And that lasted a really long time. And so it's very hard sometimes to reintegrate into a workplace, even one that's supportive, when you have experiences like this. The ripple effects from that spread quickly through space and time, and continue with the connections of social media now. We still get connected to people who knew of my brother and want to pay their regards. The aftershocks, some of them very anticipated, obviously birthdays and anniversaries and milestones where he's missed, but also the unanticipated ones. There's a picture of us that was very special to me that I thought I had lost. My brother and I actually had a song. That was our song. It was Whitney Houston's "I Will Always Love You." And whenever it played, we would swing each other around the room screaming that from the top of our lungs. We actually danced to it at my wedding. And this picture's at the end of the wedding night, and my hair's coming undone, and his tails are coming out of his coat, tuxedo back. But the expression on our face is just pure joy. And I thought I had lost it. So when I found it going through a box of photos, that was an aftershock that took me off my feet. Most importantly, however, was the special teams. So there's lots of special teams that helped rebuild in the aftermath of the Asian tsunami, and that's true for people recovering from suicide loss as well. And workplace is one of those special teams that often gets missed, and so that's what the rest of my talk is going to be, is about how workplace teams can really help in the aftermath of a suicide, and the role that you all play in helping people transition from that. So my goals today are really about understanding this concept of postvention. What does postvention mean? We understand a little bit about what prevention means, but postvention is very critical in setting the tone about what it means to be in a caring community and helping people reintegrate back. I'm going to start a little bit with the individual response to suicide, but then also talk about community response and what it means in the workplace. So what is postvention? Postvention is actually a form of prevention for the next generation. If after a suicide we say nothing, it speaks volumes. It speaks louder than anything we could have done because it tells people that we're not a safe space to help with this issue, or we don't care, or this life didn't matter. So importantly, postvention happens on two levels. On one level, it's psychological first aid. How can we reintegrate a workplace community that has been dealt with a blow as strong as suicide? How do we provide grief support and trauma support? And on the other hand, how do we prevent copycat behavior? What things can we put into place to make sure that this is a safe response? So there are 3 stages of postvention, and this is a critical point that I want to make again and again. This is not just about critical incident response. It's not just about what we do in the days or couple of weeks after this tragedy. Suicide postvention can go on and on. For the inner circle people who are most significantly affected, it can go on for years. Parents who lose children, I've seen it go on for decades. And so people have an expectation sometimes, an unrealistic expectation that you should just get over it. You just need to put it behind you. This is the kind of thing that is very, very difficult. And the reason I share my story isn't to have you feel sorry for me. In fact, there are a lot of things that have happened that I'll touch upon about kind of making meaning out of situations that help turn people's lives into a different direction. It's not for that purpose. There's a rock group called Seether, and they have a video called Rise Above It. The lead singer of this video actually lost his sibling, his brother, to suicide. And the video itself of his song really speaks to the power of what a suicide loss does to a family. But the name of the album is Finding Beauty in Negative Spaces. And I think that's really about what the challenge in the aftermath of suicide really is. The reason I share this story is because most people don't. Most people don't share how devastating suicide is for a family and a community. And because that story is not told, the larger community does not realize the impact that this has. Sure, sometimes there are high-profile suicides, especially among youth, that make consciousness, but it happens much more frequently than the general public is aware, and they don't know because we don't share the stories. So I share it to model for you that we can talk about this. We can talk about it like other important community issues and get the attention that we need to create the influence that we absolutely have to have prevention be effective. So immediate crisis response is important, but it needs to go beyond there. It needs to have longer-term support as well. So immediate crisis is about channeling communication, and it's about containing the crisis, and it's about offering practical assistance to the families and people most affected. In the short term, then we move into what psychological support or different types of debriefing things that might be needed or different types of reintegration that might be happening. But longer term, we also need support for the anniversary or milestone things that pass in a community. How do we acknowledge that? How do we support people through those transitions? All right, on an individual level, there are many things going on in the aftermath of suicide. It's a difficult loss. It's a difficult event for many reasons. First of all, for most people, it is a sudden loss. So people don't have that time to have what we call anticipatory grieving. If someone's sick in your life, and if they have cancer or other types of life-threatening illnesses, there's lots of things that happen in that transition as people are dying that help with that grieving process. Important things get to be said. Important experiences get to be had sometimes. You don't get that with a sudden loss. It just takes somebody completely out of the blue. It also tends to take people well before their time. Yes, it's taking men in the Middle Ages most of all, but these are men who should have been living 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 sometimes years more of life. They had life scripts with family and friends and things that they were going to do that didn't happen, and that's a huge loss for people to experience. The domino effect is also very considerable. So when a person in the midlife dies, which is often the case, that's where the burden of suicide rests, often that person is answering to two generations. They have older parents that were very much a part of their lives, and they often have children that were dependent and a partner. They're at the peak of their workplace responsibilities, and so all of those ripple effects go out into those systems of family and faith communities and workplaces and schools, and it is a huge, huge domino effect. People's incomes are changed, then their houses are often not being able to maintain, and over, more loss, more loss. It is a very traumatizing loss. I can remember very vividly, my husband and I were celebrating our 10th year anniversary the April following my brother's death in December, so just 5 months later. And we had planned to do a second honeymoon way before my brother died, and we decided to go forward with it, and it was in Hawaii. So here I am in one of the most beautiful places on the planet, walking around the Nepali coast, and all I can think about is the horror of my brother's death. Over and over, and I didn't witness the crime scene. It's my imagination, over and over and over again. And I said, honey, I thought about the kids maybe 3 times this morning on this walk. I've thought about my brother probably 400. It is something that's very, very hard for people to let go. To imagine those last moments is very, very traumatizing. And then the last part, if you can get through the grief, if you can get through the trauma and work through that, there's still this lingering canyon of why, is what Frank Campbell calls it. People fall into this canyon of why. Why did this happen? Why this person? Why couldn't we save them? Why couldn't we help them? Why didn't we know? And these are whys we never get answers to. We never get to that bottom of that canyon of why. And the longer we're down there, the longer we fester in trying to unravel that question that never gets answered, the longer the complicated bereavement becomes. So part of the effort is to really pull people out of that, something that never gets answered, and pull them into getting back to living. What to expect when people are bereaved by suicide? It is very common, and it seems a little strange sometimes under certain circumstances, but denial is a very strong psychological coping mechanism that we have. And I watched it happen in my own family. My brother took his life by hanging. It was pretty obvious that it was a suicide. But even one of our family members was like, well, what if he had gotten set up? You know, he had some business deals that went bad at the end there. Maybe somebody staged this. And it was a very powerful thought that she had in this interim. Why aren't they doing a homicide investigation? So denial, especially in the first few days, is common as the brain's trying to get its head wrapped around the truth of what happened. The paradox of traumatic grieving is also very complicated for people. If you think about, if you've ever had a traumatic thing like a car accident or something like that happens to you, or if you fell off a horse or whatever, our instincts in traumatic experiences to protect ourselves, our instinct is to move away, to avoid an escape, right? We move away, it's getting back into that car again or driving down that road again or whatever is anxiety provoking. We force ourselves to do it to get through it, but our instinct says, oh, don't go do that again, right? Grief response is the opposite. The grief response is about a moving towards something. It's about a connection. It's about moving towards a memory, moving towards love. All right, so within the person who's bereaved by suicide, both of those things are happening at the same time, and it's very confusing. Moving towards the loved one, moving away from the trauma, and it's kind of this push-pull thing that happens. Survivor guilt. This is very, very common, and it's very common in workplace situations. What if I had known? What if I had said something different? What if I had been more aggressive in trying to get them connected to care? What if I knew what to do? All of that festers and lingers and grows within a workplace and in families. Anger is also common. Anger at whatever is to blame, anger at the person for doing this, and it's kind of odd to be angry at a dead person. There's nothing that they can do to stand up in their favor. Shame, because of the stigma that we have around this issue, a lot of times shame shrouds a family, shrouds a friendship group. They don't know what to say. They don't know. They feel really ashamed of what has happened, and that also affects people's ability to reach out and connect with one another. Physical reactions. It's not uncommon to have what happened to me in those first few weeks afterwards, which was like, can't eat, can't sleep, having panic attacks, feeling like I'm losing my mind. Very, very common in the aftermath of really any strong traumatic reaction, but it's very unsettling, especially after you've witnessed someone kind of go through a very strong unraveling themselves. You start to worry, is this going to happen to me? And having your own suicidal thoughts is another common response. I see this very, very often with parents who've lost children. The grief is so powerful, and the desire to connect with that person becomes so strong that they have their own suicidal thoughts. And so as a community, to really support that family is critical, to really have a heightened awareness about the collateral damage of another suicide risk is a very important role that you can have for one another. And on the positive side, there's often magical things that happen in this space. Wonderful things about communities pulling together, about people finding sources of resiliency that they didn't know that they had, of growing in really positive ways in themselves and in their relationships. The empty chair is a factor. When you have milestone events or holiday gatherings or trips or weddings or funerals and this person's not there, it is a very powerful sense of absence. And I want to encourage you all, if you're feeling that grief in those absence moments, know that that grief is actually about love. That we wouldn't have this sense of longing and yearning if we didn't love that person. And to reframe that kind of sadness as honor was really helpful to me, because it was, when we feel uncomfortable emotions like that, sometimes the tendency is to shove it down. Let's push it out because it just doesn't feel good. And instead, what I would encourage you to do, for all kinds of loss really, is to open yourself up to it and think about that it is really an expression of honor and love for the person that was lost. And I love this quote. When you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you will see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. Rituals can be very, very helpful in people expressing grief. Sometimes words do not do it justice, but a ritual that we can do collectively can really help people express that loss. Rituals of remembrance sometimes that are very helpful are things like candle lighting, balloon release, dove release, things that communities can do together to honor the collective loss. Sometimes it's not just about an individual, but the collective loss of everybody who has been experiences by this. Rituals of communication are often, because it's a sudden loss, the opportunity to say things that we didn't get to say, writing those down in poetry or letters to the deceased. Rituals of nurturing are also critically important. Grief is hard work. It is very hard work. It takes every ounce of our body sometimes to process the grief experience. And so how do we take care of ourselves? How do we look out for one another and help each other through this? What are the things that we can do to help us sustain that effort of very intense grieving? Rituals of reflection are usually different things where we create pause in our day to just kind of think through and reflect on what we're dealing with and just be open to the different thoughts and emotions that comes with that. Rituals of community connection are coming together in various forms, sometimes as walks, sometimes as just standing together as part of an event. And rituals of release are rituals that we use to try to get rid of the things that are just not helpful for us anymore. The guilt, the anger, the shame. What does that look like? How do we move those unproductive emotions out of the grieving process to focus more on that, on our love? The idea of Phoenix Grievers is something that's a little challenging for people in the midst of the beginning of the suicide crisis. The idea that this could somehow move my life in a direction that has more meaning is just unfathomable to people who are in the immediacy of that loss. But I've now been in the world of suicide loss survivors for almost a decade, and I can tell you this is a very powerful process for many people. Post-traumatic growth, what happens in the aftermath of our very difficult experiences is that sometimes we reach some really core things about who we are, what we believe our role to be in the world, and how we connect to other people. And so all of these positive things are common things for people who are coming out of a tragedy like suicide or other major life challenge. A new sense of self-confidence, the ability to stand up against injustice. We've got a voice now, we've got a story to tell, and we're gonna stand up and try to make change. Deeper compassion and empathy with others. For those of you who have had experiences with depression or anxiety, you know that it is tough. I've had my own, and it is really a rough road. But to know that and have that lived experience, when you see someone else going through, you can say, you know what, I don't know exactly what you're going through, but I know when I went through it, it was tough, and so I'm just gonna walk with you through this, and you know, you can lean on me, I'll lean on you, we'll get through this together. A greater appreciation for life, you know, really watching what the aftermath of a suicide does to communities. You have a real appreciation for the fragility of life and a real appreciation of capturing the moments that are really important in their everyday living. Positive life changes and life priorities, those get shuffled up quite a bit for folks, and sometimes more in spiritual engagement is also possible. The real important piece for people in the aftermath of a suicide is building a safety net. And so when we were talking this morning about toxic workplaces, you have to be really proactive and really thoughtful about how to create senses of belonging in a place that is maybe a little bit toxic. And that can happen a lot with informal friendship structures in a workplace. But it's absolutely critical. We know that suicide is not just about stress. I want to emphasize that. Suicide is not just about stress or mental illness for that matter. It is about isolation. As human beings, we have shown again and again and again, we get through the most incredibly daunting experiences when we have each other, when we have a sense of community. When we don't, that's when things fall apart. So belongingness and community is what we need to foster in our workplaces. Even if it's not formally supported, the informal things are very critical. Actively reaching out to people in the aftermath of a bereavement episode by suicide is very important. Like I said, they fall into a canyon of why, and they start to isolate because of that shame, the anger, the questioning. So all that you can do to support one another and actively reach out to them, what do you need? Can I bring you chicken soup? Can I walk the dog? Can I help you sort out your mail? All of those things can be very appreciated for that family that is really struggling. The other piece to know is that suicide brings up dragons. It brings up dragons in people in that they go back to parts of their life when they were vulnerable, or it triggers things in them. And that's sometimes why we get the copycat effect, is that people over-identify sometimes with the person that was lost. So you have to be looking, you have to scan the environment in the aftermath of a suicide loss to see if, as what my colleague Frank Campbell says, if people are popping up like toast in areas that they shouldn't be in. Right? They've over-identified with this loss. The questions that they asked are a little bit out of the range of what would be expected. Just hanging around a little bit too much in a way that doesn't feel right. And they're just, the narrative that they're giving just indicates that this is on their mind as well. When you identify those vulnerable individuals, it's very important, again, to surround them too. Okay, so I'm going to turn now into the postvention for community. So that was largely about what individuals need. Postvention on the community level. There was a lot of tensions in this, things that pull us in two directions. As you can start to hear by what I'm talking about, the reaction to grief support is very much surrounding people and letting them talk about the story and letting them honor the life that was lived by sharing memories, right? It's about talking about that individual. The process about contagion reduction, that copycat reduction is very different than that. It's about shutting down that story, actually. It's about making sure that that one suicide does not get over too much attention, or that doesn't get talked about publicly in a very high-profile way with lots of glamorization, memorialization, and discussion about the means and all of that. So you've got these two forces that are kind of going against each other. And I am a big proponent that both are important and both can happen if we're thoughtful. This is really a private conversation. It's about what friends talk to friends about. It's about small gatherings of remembrance, okay? That's very important that we talk about that person. This is about public communication. How we communicate to the media, how we communicate to the community, really does need to get off of this individual's experience and really needs to talk about prevention. So important to transition the conversation when speaking publicly off of the individual experience and more into the world of prevention. And there's a whole art on how to do that. Another tension that's really difficult for workplaces, we know returning to the familiar structure of a workplace is healing and grounding for most people. Having some sense of control, like for 10 or 12 hours, I'm not quite sure how long these work periods are, but they're long. And having that, like, I know what I'm doing here. Like, I feel like I have a little bit of control over this period of my day. At home, it's completely different, but knowing I have a pattern here helps me feel back to something that's familiar. So how do we do both of that? How do we acknowledge something significant has impacted this workplace? And we have to get back to business as usual. Again, I'm a true proponent. Both are important, and we can do both if we are proactive and thoughtful and communicate that both are needed. A third tension that people struggle with is, what do we do about the kids? How do we talk about this with children? Many of them, in the very young years, don't even understand death, let alone something as confusing as suicide. And the instinct sometimes is to, you know what, we're not telling the kids. We can't. We're going to make something up. We're going to tell them something different, but we can't tell the kids. And that is a huge mistake. There are ways to tell children that are developmentally appropriate. Again, it's beyond the scope of the talk today to go into the details of that, but there are ways to do it where you're telling them the truth at a level that they can understand and only what they want to know. Okay, so you're not bombarding them with tons of information and certainly not details about the death in particular, but children are curious and they're also very smart. And so when you are not telling them the truth, guess what? They figure it out, and now you've got two things to deal with: a kid who's grieving the loss, usually of a parent or a sibling, and the fact that you lied to them. And sometimes they don't find out for decades, but when they do, they have to go all the way back to the age they were when the loss happened and grieve the whole thing over again. So you really don't do any favors by not telling them the truth. Figure out, and you can work with mates in construction to figure out if you're in that situation about how to tell kids, giving you some guidelines on how to do that. And then support resources. Standby, you are very, very lucky to have Standby in your country. They're a post-vention response group that goes all over the country to help people in the post-vention state grieve and come together. So call on them. Make sure that you have those support resources available to you. So again, helping children tell the truth, avoid euphemisms like he's at peace or those kinds of things, or he's asleep. Reassure them that they will continue to be loved. This is really important for kids that have had this shakeup, and consider additional resources. There are a number of national and international resources on how to help children. All right, contagion. Contagion, again, is increasing the risk that vulnerable people in your community might over-identify with the death and become more vulnerable to suicide risk themselves. And there's lots of things in the literature that we know that if we do them correctly, we decrease that risk. So one is provide permission to grieve. People need to do that, but they need to do it safely. Be conscious of the language and safe messaging. And by that I mean, even the phrase commit suicide is considered derogatory. It came out of a time when suicide was thought of as a crime and as a sin. And so that's how it emerged. We don't say commit cancer. Even successful suicide, unsuccessful suicide, these are things that have to do with success. So be conscious of the language that you're using. And we say die by suicide or killed oneself. That's where we go to in messaging around this now. Safe messaging also doesn't go into the details about the means. And that's challenging for people because people need to fill the gaps in of the narrative of what happened to the person they cared about. But when you're publicly communicating about suicide, it's very important not to go into the details of the means or the details of kind of the end-of-life story. People over-identify that, and they actually learn how to do that sometimes. They learn how to take their life if there's too much detail around that issue. Surveillance, linking vulnerable people to resources, preparing for anniversary reactions or milestone reactions. So for example, in a workplace, if this work team had been working towards a large project, and then someone takes their life, and then the project gets completed, the absence of that person is often very strongly felt. How do we prepare for that? How do we honor that? And then provide guidance on the need to memorialize. Memorialization is an instinct that we have as humans. It's going to happen. People need to have ritual space to honor that life that was lived. And if we don't guide that process, it's going to happen spontaneously, and sometimes it's going to be unsafe. So as leaders in this field, to learn about the importance of safe memorialization is as critical as you're trying to guide these workplaces on how to do that. My first question when workplaces ask me, what do we do? I said, well, how do you handle other types of death in the workplace? How do you handle if someone dies in a car accident? How do you handle if someone dies of cancer? Start there. Whatever your workplace culture is about how we grieve loss in our workplace, start there. If the culture is, we all go out for a drink afterwards, or we send chicken soup home with somebody, we pass around a sympathy card, whatever it is, make sure that there's some kind of sense of continuity between other types of losses and suicide loss. Practice safe messaging for public communication around the loss. Celebrate the life and acknowledge the tragedy, and then channel the grief in a life-giving way. So by that I mean our instincts sometimes, and I heard these stories yesterday when we were doing the professional development session, is to somehow create a shrine somewhere, right? At the death site, or maybe where the person had a work locker, or at a desk, or whatever. Any type of permanent memorial for suicide is really discouraged, or even the shrining thing that sometimes happens, because it becomes such a marker for this tragedy that people who were not involved in this at all come across it, and now they too are brought into the fold of the ripple effects of this death. So permanent markers are very discouraged, but that doesn't mean we don't do anything. There's lots of ways that we can channel the grief in a very positive and affirming way. One of those is to collect all the people who are intimately involved and want to do something, and gather donations and give it to a cause that the person who died would have really loved to have supported. Maybe it's something around animals or the environment, or maybe it's about mental health, maybe it's mates in construction. But really channeling that grieving energy in a positive way. Another way is to collect stories or mementos or photographs from the friends, the workmates, people who had great experiences with the person who died. Collect those and somehow package them in a quilt or a book or whatever, and give them to the family. That's something very powerful that friends can do, and very, very meaningful for the family left behind. All right, what does postvention look like at work? This wasn't even a conversation we were having more than 3 years ago. So the fact now that we have some national guidelines that are best practices is we've come a long way, baby. And this is a public domain free download. And for all of you in the room, please look at the URL, workingminds.org, and get this resource somewhere where it's just in time, somewhere it's accessible just in time for the people who are making decisions about how do we handle suicide in the aftermath in a workspace. It's a collaborative project by our organization and several other national organizations in the U.S. It went through a huge vetting process and just recently got on the National Best Practice Registry in December, so it's been very, very well reviewed. It gives the leaders 10 action steps on what they need to do, concrete things that they need to do in the aftermath of suicide, all the way from the immediate through the longer term. And it really is designed for somebody who's dealing with a crisis. So somebody who doesn't have a lot of time or a lot of bandwidth in their head to really think about a lot of stuff. It gives them very actionable things. So checklists and flow charts and communication templates, how to talk to the media, how to notify your workforce, et cetera. And the 10 steps are, I'm not going to go into them in depth, but you can access the book, but are really about coordinating and containing the crisis, notifying the workforce in a respectful way, respecting the privacy of the family, but also respecting the workmates' need to know about what happened, communicating what we know and what we don't know, offering support, usually in the form of practical assistance to those most immediately affected, linking in the short term, linking to more intensive support resources like standby, like counseling services, like debriefing, comforting, finding healthy ways for the workforce to grieve this together, restoring the workplace functioning, getting back to work, finding ways to transition people back to the thing that's familiar, the things that they know how to do well. And leadership, absolutely critical in this space. Leaders, I think, sometimes go into a fear mode in the aftermath of this, fear of being sued, fear that this is going to happen again, fear of what did I miss. But what they really need to do is kind of put the fear behind them and be very strong in these moments. Be strong in acknowledging the tremendous impact that this has on their work team. Be strong in acknowledging compassion. That's probably the biggest thing. If they can acknowledge compassion and really even talk about, kind of what we saw up here modeled by the panel, the impact that this has had, it gives everybody else permission to do that. It's very powerful. And then the transition to resilience and prevention, really talking about the resilience of this work community and the transition into a new wave of being. And then longer, finding ways to honor, especially around anniversary dates, and then sustaining the effort. When there is a loss like this, it does often become an opportunity to channel that energy about how did we miss this into energy of prevention, to really bring forth the resources and the engagement of that workforce to do things differently from then on. So I have just a little bit of time left for some questions. If there are some, I'd be happy to take them, and if not, we can have a longer break.
Sally, thanks very much for your presentation. I was just wondering, in terms of the ripple effect, how did your kids react and how did they cope with Carson's death? And I suppose not more importantly, but just as importantly, how did Carson's wife handle the death?
Well, I told you a little bit, her first reaction was that it was a homicide. I mean, it took a very long time for that to process. My kids were really little. They were 6, 4, and 3 months when it happened, and so we told them that Carson had died from results of his mental illness, that he had been very ill, and that he had died from that. When they were 10 and 7, my oldest two marched into the bathroom. You can imagine 3 kids, 2 working parents. It's chaos every morning, absolute chaos. And so here they go. They're going to have this conversation with this. We're 20 minutes late already. Here we go. They walk in, and my oldest says, "We figured out how Carson died." Not that it was a secret, but like they finally made all the connections. They're like, "He died by suicide. We've been talking about Van Gogh in class, and that's kind of how Uncle Carson died, right?" And I said, "Yeah." It was kind of like they finally coalesced, and so we just sat down in the bathroom floor and had a 20-minute chat about the importance of that, and also then transition that conversation into, and if you ever feel that way, you need to come to me right away. And that was all they needed, actually. They come with me on all the walks I do, all the talks I do. My middle boy has raised money for suicide prevention for teens. Like, they're fully in the cause with me now, but they kind of had to come to that own realization after a number of dots got connected. My brother's wife has certainly had her own journey of this as well. She took a very different approach with their daughter. She was very worried, both from the genetic predisposition that happens with mental illness, that perhaps her daughter was going to be vulnerable to that, and was very worried about the copycat effect with her, and so she made a decision not to tell her daughter, which then put a rift in our family. I only had my brother. I have no other siblings, and we live in the same area. So for a couple of years, I couldn't see my niece because she was worried that my kids would tell her. This is the kind of stuff that happens in families around this issue. It was devastating for all of us because that was a whole other loss that we didn't anticipate. And she said, you made your choice about how to deal with your child. I'm making mine. And I don't judge her for this. It's a very difficult space for families to navigate. But she didn't anticipate telling Kaya till she was a teenager. So that was really hard to cope with. But Kaya knew. Kaya knew from the very beginning. And so she told her mom, "Mom, I know." And then we got back into their lives. So, but those kind of ripple things happen. I mean, my father, and again, fathers of sons, one of the hardest things I see over and over again. We're doing a whole research project right now on men and grief and suicide because there's just whole different needs there that we're not really prepared for. My brother was his project, When my brother was successful, it was my father's greatest moments. And when my brother had troubles, as he often did, because he was just kind of a reckless guy, it was my father's project to make sure that he got back on track. So when he died, my father kind of lost his purpose in life. And there were 3 or 4 years around that anniversary date when I thought, this is it. This is the year we're going to lose my dad, too. He would always threaten to leave. He did disappear once for 3 days. I mean, over and over again. Families really struggle. And we're a family that, generally speaking, we're pretty resilient. We're pretty normal, just not a lot of chaos. So it just happens this way. It just is a very, very challenging thing.
Thanks, Sally. It's my job just to quickly reflect and
Oh,
thank
okay.
you for your talk.
Well,
So-
let me just close with a quote then. In the night of death, hope sees a star, and listening love can hear the rustle of the wing. Thank you for all being merchants of hope in this world of suicide prevention.